about Pavlov. All right, now, we talked about, I'm pretty sure, didn't we talk about habituation and sensitization? We did not. Well, that's all right. It's back, I think, in chapter 1. I think it's in chapter 1. We're going to talk about it. This is perfectly fine to talk about it now. There are two, what we call non-associative forms of learning. One's called habituation. We're going to start with the most basic kind of learning. And one's called habituation. And the other one is called sensitization. Very basic forms of learning. These two forms of learning probably have a lot of evolutionary adaptive significance, and they're called non-associative forms of learning because there are no particular associations formed. It's a general sort of orientation or a way of responding to the world. And habituation is this phenomenon we've noticed where you tend to respond less to repeated stimulation. You respond less. It's learning to respond less to repeated presentations of the same stimulus. Sensitization is kind of the opposite of that. It's learning to over-respond, not to a specific stimulus, but just to lots of different things. Sensitization is not stimulus-specific, hence non-associative form of learning, but it is a sort of a general over-responding to the world. And some learning is involved. It's not just reflexive. It's not a reflex. And habituation is learning to under-respond or respond less to repeated presentations of a stimulus. So, for example, but I will say this. I also would like to say this. Your book just has probably a very short section on this. We don't know as much about habituation and sensitization. These are actually two forms of learning we don't know that. We don't know as much as maybe we would like to know. And when I say that, what do I mean we don't know as much as we'd like to know? What I mean is it's difficult to predict when you're going to habituate and when you're going to sensitize. That's what we have trouble. And remember I said an important aspect of understanding is being able to predict. If you can't predict something, then you don't understand it very well. And these are two of the things that we don't understand as well as we would like to understand. But we do know that sometimes you respond less to repeated presentation of the stimulus, and sometimes you have a tendency to over-respond. But exactly when that's going to happen, then I come back to my phrase for the new millennium. It depends. What does it depend on? Lots of stuff. All right, habituation. I'll give you an example. But stop me if I already told you this. We didn't discuss these? I'm kind of surprised. All right. But this would come right before Pavlov, which is a little more complex form of learning. Anyway, so my wife and I, we went to San Francisco for half business, half pleasure. Her business, my pleasure. And, well, we went there. She had some business meetings she had to go to. And so I was like, oh, I want to go. And by the way, I love San Francisco. Anybody in here ever been there? I don't know. You like San Francisco? I love San Francisco. I could live in San Francisco. And, you know, they have on Fisherman's Wharf, I don't know if either one of you saw it, they have like the largest collection of mechanical, fun arcade stuff, like antique stuff, like I believe in the world. It's the largest collection. It's in one of those giant warehouses on the pier there. Anyway, if you ever get there again, check it out. It's just unbelievable. But San Francisco, we stayed on the main square, and I forget what the name of that square is, but there's a hotel there, an old hotel, called the St. Francis, I think, and we stayed in there. We're coming out to go do some sightseeing. Then this square is up on a hill, and Fisherman's Wharf is down here, and we're going to go down, take the trolley car, and go down to Fisherman's Wharf. So we come out of the hotel, and we have our map. I'm trying not to look like a tourist because I figure, well, every poacher in the world is going to be out there waiting for us. So, but we got the map. But all she's saying is Starbucks, Starbucks, where's the Starbucks? You know? And I'm like, yeah, okay. And then this guy comes out of the shadows, and he says, excuse me, you know, and there's lots of street people living on the street in San Francisco. That's one thing about San Francisco I don't like. You're literally stepping over bodies. I mean, the place is just, they're all over. And they're all like my age, and they look like leftover hippies that just never wanted to get a job. You know, that's what they look like. And so anyway, a guy comes out. He's holding a Bible. So he's a real master social psychologist. He's trying to create some face validity. Bible, I'm trustworthy. You can trust me. So he's got his Bible, and he comes up, and he wants $2. And what he said was that he worked at the hotel where we were staying, but he forgot it was his day off, and he didn't bring enough money to take the bus home. So he wanted $2 so he could get the bus to go home. And so I've learned from traveling now that I always carry about $20 of single dollar bills, and this is for a nuisance tax. I call it a nuisance tax. There are going to be these nuisances all along the way, so I'm not going to argue with her trying. You know, it's like, here's $2. Here's another dollar over here. I'm paying my taxes. You know. It's easier that way. What do you have? $10? Okay, so here's some money. Here's some money for you. So anyway, he said he's so trustworthy. He said that this was not a gift. He wanted to make sure he paid us back. So that if we would just tell him what hotel room we were in, what room number, he would make sure we got reimbursed the next day when he came to work. Let me see. So we're leaving the hotel. You're reasonably sure we're not coming back because you're going to have your little look out there, and then you're going to go up to our room, jimmy the lock, get in there, steal everything we have in there, and won't that be a nice trip? And so I said, it's okay. It's a gift. It's a tax. Here you go. You know. Now, we're sensitized because this is a novel situation. When you're in a novel environment, you tend to get sensitized. Unfamiliar surroundings, novel stimuli. You're, you know, like here, we come out of the hotel. What are we doing? Car horn. You know, a bus horn. All this stuff. We're doing this. Sensitized. We're over-responding to pretty much everything. You know. And you can't process all this information, you know, like the guy wanting the $2 and Starbucks and the math and Fisherman's Wharf, and so we're just like, you know, doing this and just reeling, you know. I mean, you probably experienced that when you go into a strange city for the first time, and it's very tiring. I mean, you know, it's exhausting, you know. But at the end of the day, you're just like, yeah, okay. So anyway, after about 3 days. We're coming out of the hotel, and we're not sensitized anymore. We've habituated to these various stimuli. So guess what? That guy was there every day. He must really not know the schedule because he's there every day asking, but he wasn't asking us. And so other people were coming up to us, and we're just like, okay, fine. But I know where the Starbucks is now, so I'm going straight to the Starbucks. Don't bother me, you know. But we habituated. So first you tend to be sensitized, and then you habituate. But what, to everything? No, it depends. You tend to become sensitized to loud stimuli, intense stimuli. You tend to habituate to like slightly less intense stimuli. That's a general rule that we know about sensitization. I don't think they say that in the book. But here's another interesting thing. There was a study done, it's not in the book, that where what they did was they presented a burst of white noise to some subjects. I think it was about 80 decibels, which is like, you know, pretty loud. The same level of stimulus to all subjects. But what they did was in one of the experimental groups, they had relatively low ambient background noise. For the other group, they had intense background noise. The stimulus, the target stimulus, was exactly the same volume, okay? Now the question is, which group is going to, well, what are you going to find? What they found out was that when the background noise was very loud and intense, you tended to become sensitized to that stimulus, that burst of white noise. When it was very soft, you tended to habituate to it. But wait a minute, the target stimulus did not change. It was the same stimulus. So when you're going to sensitize, when you sensitize and become habituated, apparently, has something to do with the contrast, or at least the difference between a target stimulus and the ambient background noise. So you got to take that into consideration. In addition to the general level of the target stimulus, you got to take into consideration its relationship to background noise. So you see it becomes more complex. Here's another thing, an interesting thing. So you're saying, oh, well, you just become sensitized and you don't habituate, you become sensitized to loud, you tend to loud intensity stimuli, right? How about this? Train whistles at night, pretty loud, but after a while, they put you to sleep. Loud stimulus, you habituate. How about this one? You're laying there, what do you think is the likelihood that you're going to habituate to this sound when you're trying to go to sleep? Very low stimulus level, right? Like a mosquito buzzing around your head? You think you're going to habituate to that? Oh, it doesn't bother me. Let me just go to sleep. Very low level intensity, you are not going to habituate to that. You're sensitized to that. So it depends on the kind of stimulus that you're talking about. Maybe meaning, you know. So you have the general idea between habituation and sensitization. Here you go out to the beach. Well, I know, let's camp out. This will be a nice relaxing vacation. Set up camp on the beach, right? You think you're going to get a lot of sleep there? Oh, you hear the waves, and this will be relaxing. No, a twig, any little sound, you're like, you know. And then, by the way, I tell you, meaning, I say, and by the way, we park ranger, we just stopped by to tell you that there had been a recent escape from the local prison, and they've been seen in the general area. Have a nice night. You go to a hotel room. Oh, I know, it's got to do with the beach. You don't really sleep well on sand. It's, you know, a hotel room. I'll sleep well there. Oh, really? Every time the air conditioner kicks on, they put the newspaper underneath your door. At 5 a.m., they slip the bill under there. Yeah, all night long, you're like, little sounds that you're not familiar with, novel stimuli. So you come back more tired, you know, generally speaking. You know, it's a lot of work. Going on vacation is a heck of a lot of work. It really is. Because you're processing so much, such mental load involved in that, you know. Anyway, any questions about this? No particular associations, general orientations or ways of responding to the world, but it does involve experience, which is why it qualifies as learning, but non-associative learning. Very basic kinds of, evolutionarily, I think, important types of learning. Now we're moving into another type of learning, and that's called, this is an associative form of learning. Associative learning theories. Wait a minute, you mean this has something to do with Aristotle and his laws of association? Going way back when. Contiguity. Yeah, you remember that from chapter 3? No, of course you don't. You haven't read it yet. Anyway, chapter 3. I think I understand you. Because I can make predictions about your behavior. When are you going to read chapter 3? Let's see, the 7th of October. I give it about the end of September. But associative forms of learning. There are some learning theories that are based very much on you making connections between events that occur together closely in time. Two things occur together in time, you connect them together. This is the work of a guy named I.P. Pavlov. Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, or Petrovich. Ivan Petrovich Pavlov. And this first type of learning theory we're going to talk about, his theory, is called classical conditioning. Classical conditioning, Ivan Pavlov. I have my various brushes with greatness, and I'll tell you, I was in California a couple of years ago, and we were driving along Highway 101 heading up to San Francisco, which you should do once in your lifetime, but not twice. But once is okay, particularly heading north. You don't want to do it going south, because when you're going through Big Sur, which is this huge national park up there, you're driving along a little 2-lane road that goes around mountains like this for 4 hours. It's just, and if you're driving south, you're on the outside lane. And I asked my sister who lives there, I said, what happens when a car goes off the cliff? Because it's like hundreds and hundreds of feet down, you smash on the rocks in the Pacific Ocean, that's it. And there's nobody there. Nobody lives there. I mean, it's just this big, giant park, you know. And she goes, well, nothing. There's nothing they could do. It's just, that's it. I mean, you see these rusted out cars and stuff down there. It's like, yeah, maybe they'll find you, maybe they won't. You know? So if you go north, you're on the inside lane, which is okay. But I'm telling you, I started going batty after 3 hours of, you know, like that. But in any event, so we're driving north, and we went through this little town. Well, you probably heard of Santa Barbara, California. It's north of Los Angeles, maybe an hour and a half, something like that. And there's the University of California, Santa Barbara branch there. Really nice place to go to school and live. And in there, there's a small town close by called Solvang. Anybody in here ever been to Solvang? It's a little like Dutch-German community. And it's great. It's just outside Santa Barbara. If you ever get there, go to Solvang. You can get like German food, and it's just like you stepped into Dusseldorf or something, you know, and get all this great Dutch and German food. And there's an Indian casino there too, which is pretty cool. But aside from that, we were in the little community there where they have all these little shops and, you know, crafts and things and restaurants. So my wife wanted to go shopping, and I said, well, you go ahead. I'm going to sit on a bench here outside, and I'll be right here. You know, so she's going. I'm sitting there on this bench, and I look across the street, and here's this place called, it's Pavlov's Art Gallery. I'm going, Pavlov's Art Gallery? This is pretty weird. So I thought, how many people in the world are named Pavlov? So I walked in, and here are all these paintings of like ballerinas and stuff on the wall. And there's a guy in the back room painting. I could see him back there, and then he came out. He said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm just kind of curious." I said, "You wouldn't happen to be any relation, would you?" And he goes, "No, I've never seen you before." And I said, "Not me." I said, "Ivan Pavlov. Are you related to Ivan Pavlov?" And he says, "Yes, I'm his great-grandson." I said, "No kidding." I said, "What a small world." I said, "Because I'm a psychologist." He goes, "Yeah, I know. I studied psychology, too." I said, "You did?" I said, "Where did you study psychology?" "UC Santa Barbara." And I said, you have a PhD in psychology? He goes, no. He said, "I studied it and got an undergraduate degree, but decided I just wasn't interested in psychology. And I always wanted to be an artist, so I opened up this little artist studio, and I'm painting." And I said, "Well, what brought you to Santa Barbara?" He said, "Well, I met my wife in Russia, and she was from there, so I moved over here, and here I am, you know." I said, "Wow." I said, "That's just fascinating." So I said, "Can I have your autograph?" So that's my brush with greatness with Pavlov. I met his grandson, or maybe his great-grandson, in Santa Barbara there, so you can insult that. So you can go talk to him. Pavlov, classical conditioning. What you need to know is that he was a Russian physiologist. He wasn't a psychologist. He was interested in digestion and cardiac function in dogs. He was a physician and a surgeon. And he was interested in cardiac function and digestion in dogs. What's that got to do with psychology? Nothing so far. Okay, so what he did was he had a dog in a harness, and wanting to be a good scientist, you know, late 1800s, turn of the century, he wanted to come up with some operational definitions for digestion. So what he did was he put a fistula, a tube, through the side of the dog's face, connected it to the salivary duct directly, and he cut a hole in the dog's throat, and then he would give the dog some food. The food would go out the hole in the dog's throat, and but then, as the dog began to salivate, the saliva would run down the little tube and into a bottle, dripping. And so then he used that, drops of saliva, as his measurement of digestion, one of them. So that's a very clear, observable way of measuring digestion, drops of saliva. And he also cut a hole in a dog's stomach and put a fistula in there with a bottle, and he's collecting drops of gastric secretions from the dog's stomach. That was another measure of digestion. Why saliva? Well, because digestion begins in your mouth. Your saliva starts breaking down food as soon as you put it in your mouth. So he had 2 measures of digestion. And he was also interested in cardiac function in dogs. What's that got to do with psychology? Nothing. So he's doing this. But here's what it has to do with, here's where psychology comes in. So he noticed that over time, when he would go in to feed the dogs, they would start to salivate before they ever got any food in their mouth. And so he started thinking, now wait a minute, what's the stimulus here that's causing the response of salivation? There's no stimulus. I mean, there's no food on a dog's tongue. Why is this dog salivating? And he started thinking about it, and he said, well, I think the reason the dog is salivating is there's got to be something going on in the mind of the dog. So he called the salivation to, well, he hadn't identified it yet. As it turns out, it was the sound of footsteps of people coming into the lab. And when the dog heard those footsteps, he started salivating right away. Experiment hasn't started yet. Dog's already salivating. He figured out it was the sound of the footsteps of the attendants coming in to prepare the dog. And he said, now, but you can't eat footsteps. Footsteps are not on your tongue. So what's going on? He said that this was caused by some mental event in the dog. He called those psychic secretions. These drops of saliva, this salivation to the sound of the attendants, he called psychic secretions, mental secretions. Now we're starting to get into psychology here. By the way, why would a dog salivate to the sound of footsteps before they ever get food in their mouth? What's that? Boy, that's a big leap right there. A big leap of faith. They know it's coming? What does that mean for a dog? He knows it's coming. He has a mental picture in his head of food coming. And how do you know that? That's a little circular, isn't it? He drools. Why? Because he knows it's coming. How does he know it's coming? Because he drools. He drools. Why? Because he knows. Why does he know? Because it's coming. He drools. That's a little circular reasoning right there. We don't want to go with that one. Unless you do a mind meld with this dog or something, you're never going to know what's going on in the head of that dog. Except that he is salivating when footsteps are there. Okay. But why would a dog, aside from the fact that, but by the way, that's not a trivial question or a point. You could, and psychologists do talk about expectancies, like the dog expects, or maybe more basic, anticipates. Anticipating, meaning he makes a response before that stimulus gets there. Maybe that's a little safer word to use, anticipates versus he knows it's coming. What? And he clearly does associate it, and that this is a form of associative learning, and that's exactly what Pavlov said, is that he associates the footsteps with the food. And furthermore, he even said that he went on to speculate about stuff going on in the nervous system. He said there's actually connections being formed in the brain of the dog between neurons. But, of course, they didn't have a real sophisticated neurophysiology at that time either, so this was all speculation, But anyway, he began, and you can buy his original book, it's translation, obviously, called Conditioned Reflex, The Conditioned Reflex. You can buy that in paperback. You can get it probably at Barnes & Nobles or something. It's not very expensive. If you're just dying to read Pavlov's original experiments, you can get The Conditioned Reflex. And so I have a copy of that book, and if you read it, the first chapter or two, what he does is he talks about his preparation, which you need. That's a technical term for his experimental apparatus, his experimental preparation. And his preparation is a dog hanging there in a harness with tubes coming out of him, and attendants coming in and presenting food in a dish. And that's the preparation. Now, the paradigm, the model, the theoretical model is this. And in chapter 2, I think it is, he starts to define his terms. So he's basically defining terms in chapter 2. And then from chapter 3 on, he talks about specific learning phenomena like extinction, generalization, etc. And then just goes through his experiments. I mean, one experiment after another, and here's the results. It's kind of interesting, actually, to see how he wrote some of his early writings. But he started labeling things. And so for the basic theoretical paradigm or model, we have to label some things, and food is one of those things. Now, we should probably make a distinction between a stimulus and a response. This may seem trivial to you, but it's not so trivial because sometimes it gets a little confusing. A stimulus, singular, is something that stimulates a sense receptor cell. It's something you can sense, you can detect. It's something that happens to you. Like if I pinch you, ow, that's a stimulus. The pinch is a stimulus. Me going, ow, that's a response. So a response is a type of behavior. A stimulus, generally speaking, is something that you can experience. It stimulates sense receptors. I could say hello to you. That's a stimulus for you. That's me. That's a response from me. But for you, it's a stimulus. Hello. And then generally, what do you do if I say hello? You say, hello, back. That's a response. But your response of hello now is a stimulus from me. How are you doing? That's me saying, that's a response from me to your hello, saying, how are you doing? And then now that's a stimulus for you. It's my response, it's your stimulus. And now you go, fine. Oh, that fine now is your response, but that's a stimulus from me. Fine. Good. Okay. Thanks. Good to see you. You too. Bye. Bye. That's a chain of behaviors, stimuli and responses for two people in a conversation. Oh, I know. You're sitting there going, my God, conversations can be analyzed in terms of stimuli and responses and habits. Yes, absolutely. How much thought goes into, hey, how are you doing? Good, okay, good to see you. Okay, goodbye. Okay. Down the road, You're giving devote a lot of deep thought to that little interaction? No, it just reels off, You might give a little more thought to it, though, if the last time you saw the person you say, hey, how are you doing? And they slighted you in some way, and so you go, Oh, we'll talk about that. We could analyze conversations like that using these theories. But for now, let's stick with food. It's a stimulus. And furthermore, in his book, he called it the unconditional stimulus. Unconditional stimulus. I'm going to abbreviate that using the letters US. But you need to know this in your book. Now, in that Conditioned Reflexes, when he wrote it, he used the word unconditional stimulus. In your text, where is it? On page 152, is it? 152, at the bottom of 152, they call it the unconditioned stimulus. But I'm going to tell you that he originally called it the unconditional stimulus. And then we screwed it up. The English translation, we screwed it up and said, oh, it's unconditional stimulus. It is not. He called it the unconditional stimulus. And if you put food in an organism's mouth, like us, what do? We salivate. Every time. By the way, that's a reflex. And so was that. That was a spastic reflex. That's a reflex. It's automatic. This relationship is automatic. It's reflexive. Food in the mouth, salivate. Every time. Food in the mouth, salivate. He called this the unconditional response. Now, why would he call food the unconditional stimulus and salivation the unconditional response? Why use those words, unconditional? I bet you can guess. You don't have to be a panel of experts to guess. What's that? Unconditional. No other conditions necessary. I put food in your mouth, you salivate. Oh, any conditions necessary? No, it's unconditional. Unconditional stimulus, unconditional response. No other conditions necessary. Now, let's say that we have footsteps over here. He gave that a name. He called, initially they're neutral stimuli. They don't have any, dogs don't have any particular meaning. The footsteps, they hear footsteps, I hear footsteps. I'm not walking around going, every time I hear people walking down the hallway. But when these footsteps just precede getting food in the mouth, and I'm talking by half a second or so, what happens? Contiguity, close pairing in time, that's the type of association, contiguity. If you pair two things together closely in time like that, a neutral stimulus with a reflex eliciting stimulus, guess what happens to this reflexive response here? It starts occurring earlier. It'll start happening to the footsteps. Remember, the attendants come in, dog's salivating already. That reflexive response starts to occur earlier in time to this neutral stimulus, which now is not neutral anymore. He called that the conditioned, he actually called it the conditional stimulus. And he called this salivation here the conditional response. Why would he call footsteps the conditional stimulus and this the conditional response? I bet you can guess. There's a condition. There's a condition necessary. You want to get somebody to salivate the footsteps? Oh, yeah. Are they going to do it automatically? No. So what conditions have to be met? You got to pair the footsteps with food. That's the condition. It's conditional. It's based on you making this association. That's why he called it the conditional stimulus. There's a condition necessary for this to happen. What's the condition? Pair these two things together closely in time. And if you do that, you're going to get a conditional response. If you don't do that, you're not going to get that conditional response. Now, the reason I use the word conditional is both because that's what he said, and secondly, because I think it actually makes more sense than the word conditioned. And so I think it's actually easier to get a handle on why this happens using those terms. But from here on out, I'm going to use the terms that are in your textbook, which is conditioned, unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, and so on. I'll use those terms from now on, but I wanted you to know that where that came from. Okay, so if I pair footsteps with food, footsteps are neutral, don't have any meaning for me. Now we get into the mental life here again of the dog. But if I pair it together with food, then the organism may anticipate the food and start salivating to the footsteps. Yes, that's called acquisition. That is the phenomenon known as acquisition in classical conditioning. It's the acquiring of a newly learned response. Acquisition. Acquiring a new response. Okay. Now, before I go any further with this, it's 6:30. I want to show you a videotape, Pavlov, the conditioned reflex. I think it's an old footage, but it's good. It is a lot of original footage of Pavlov in his laboratory in Russia, outside St. Petersburg, and which they refer to as Leningrad in here. And it got renamed Leningrad after Lenin, but then they recently changed it back to St. Petersburg. So when they say Leningrad in here, they're referring to St. Petersburg again in Russia. The two main, the original capital of Russia. Now it's Moscow. And but anyway, a lot of original footage in here, so I think you'll find it interesting. And there are other basic learning phenomena which we're going to take up next week, and we're just going to go through those, and then we're going to talk about recent developments in classical conditioning and John Watson. That'll be next week and heading into the 26th. Then we'll talk about Guthrie on the 26th in review. Guthrie will be a relatively short discussion, so we'll be able to get through that. If you're really the lion's share of the material for this test is a lot of it is on Pavlov, and those introductory chapters. Let's take a look. By the way, Pavlov was a very big deal. He was no small potato. He won a Nobel Prize for his work in digestion and physiology. Furthermore, There's a publication. How many of you subscribe to Science News? There's this great publication. When you were a kid in school, remember you had the little weekly reader, kind of brought you in, had a little current topic. There's this publication for adults. It's called Science News. It's a little pricey. It's about $150 a year, but you get it every week, like your weekly reader. And it brings you up to speed on the latest cutting-edge research in chemistry, biology, physiology, medicine, psychology, physics, astronomy. It's great. I don't subscribe to it right now, but I did for many years. And what's funny is you read an article in there, and then like the next day you'll see the story on CNN on their science thing, because but what's great about it is the articles are written so that you don't have to be a chemist to understand the article in chemistry. And there's cutting edge stuff in psychology in there too. Well, he was on the cover of Science News, I think in 1901 or something like that. That publication goes all the way back to 1900. So you can see it though in the library. They subscribe to Science News over there. In the current periodicals, you can actually get a copy of it and read it. It's great. It's a great publication. Anyway, he was a big deal around the turn of the century in the world. It wasn't just, like I said, he wasn't small potatoes. And I don't want this thing to start, so I gotta hit pause. Well, I'll run it back. Would you mind someone hit the little black switch here? It'll bring the screen down, please. You gotta push it all the way down. Thanks. We have 24 seconds to blast off. Yeah, that Pavlov's grandson or great-grandson or whatever, it's just like, yeah, the world is such a small place. I mean, I was just like, whoa. This music in here, it sounds like some kind of propaganda music or something, Russian propaganda. Could somebody turn off the lights? It'd probably be easier to watch, easier on the eyes.
It is quite clear that the activity of even such insignificant organs as the salivary glands penetrates unconsciously into our everyday psychical conditions through sensations, desires, and thoughts, which in turn exert an influence on the work of the glands themselves. We see no reason why the same should not apply to the other organs of the body. It is indeed by means of such unconscious impressions that the usual physiological processes of our bodies are guided. Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, the man who spoke these words, is linked indissolubly with this city, once St. Petersburg, now Leningrad. Here he studied, lived, and worked. Just as Darwin had robbed man's vision of a fixed biological order, so 50 years later, Ivan Petrovich Pavlov was to change man's conception of himself, his behavior, and his learning processes. Now Pavlov's apartment is a museum. Everything remained in place as it was. The things speak about the characteristics of their owner, the simple, punctual, kind, and stubborn man. The But these things cannot tell you about his devotion to science, his experimental research. There is a great deal that the things cannot speak about. A bear skin. Pavlov never went hunting for bears. This was a present. A piano, on which he never played, others played. Pavlov loved to listen. Here are his books: literature, science, philosophy. They will tell you a great deal. But a man's work defines him best. A colleague recalls, days would go on until 9 o'clock in the evening. Then I would climb the stairs, would ring, and Ivan Petrovich himself would open the door. He had already had a chance to rest. Ivan Petrovich followed a rigid, measured ritual. He would sit down to drink some tea, he'd invite a visitor to join him, and sometimes, while they were drinking tea, conversations would begin on themes which were of interest to him. Pavlov's father, Peter Dmitrovich, a priest, lived in the ancient city of Ryazan on the Oka River, in the very center of Russia. And it was here, on September the 14th, 1849, that his eldest son was born, Ivan Vanya, in a house among apple orchards which his father had grown. Children must continue what their fathers had begun. Following this rule, Peter Dmitrovich sent his son to a church school. Ivan studied well, but he didn't always get good grades in the deportment. After the church school, a theological seminary. One could count the months remaining until the completion of his studies. But in the garret of the future priest, there appeared books of a non-ecclesiastical nature. A drawing of the digestive system in George Henry Lewis' Physiology of Common Life decided Pavlov's fate. How did this complicated system work? Young Pavlov has to find out. The priest-to-be left the seminary and went off to the capital city of St. Petersburg. In 1870, Pavlov took his first steps in science at the University of St. Petersburg. Here he was awarded a gold medal for his work with Ilya Sion, the professor of physiology. From the university, Pavlov entered the Military Medical Academy in order to become not merely a physiologist, but a good surgeon-experimenter as well. The well-known therapeutist Botkin and the physiologist Sechenov became his teachers. Botkin invited the able student to his clinic. In a small laboratory in this clinic, Ivan Petrovich created his first scientific work, Centrifugal Cardiac Nerves, about the influence of one of the nerves on the work of the cardiac muscles. This was a new idea in physiology. For this dissertation, Pavlov was awarded the degree of Doctor of Medicine. While at the Medical Academy, the young scholar also perfected his skill as a surgeon in the operating room. He astonished the faculty and students with the brilliance of his experiments. Can I see it? Can I measure it? Can I repeat my results? These three criteria guided Pavlov's first great investigation into the working of the digestive tract. In the Institute of Experimental Medicine, Pavlov devised a method of operating which allows one to follow the process of digestion firsthand in the living organism, while at the same time not causing injury to the nerve connections. Now scholars could explain the chemical nature of the processes taking place in the stomach of an animal and that of man. For this work, Ivan Petrovich was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1904. He was invited to give lectures in universities throughout the world. Scholars from many countries flocked to see him. Pavlov honors became too numerous to count. Pavlov could tolerate fame, so long as it did not interfere with his time in the laboratory. In 1912, Pavlov was invited to England for the presentation to him of the degree of Doctor of Cambridge University. The speeches of welcome resounded in classical Latin. A solemn ceremony, which had been sanctified by the centuries, took place. And when it had come to an end, directly from the gallery, a salivating little dog with test tubes hanging from it fell into the hands of Pavlov. Among the students responsible for the prank was the grandson of Darwin. Both animals and man are born with the ability, from birth, to swallow food, to breathe. Pavlov called these abilities unconditioned reflexes. But under the influence of the surrounding environment, reflexes, which Pavlov called conditioned reflexes, appeared in the animal. When the dog sees food, its mouth, as we say, waters. But if a light is constantly switched on just before the dog is fed, after a while the switching on of the light will evoke salivation, although there is no food at the same time. Pavlov proved that a temporary connection is formed in the brain of the dog, a connection between the light and being fed. A conditioned reflex had appeared. It could be generated by sounds, by light, by any signals. And during salivation, it was possible to trace the reflex processes through the quantity of saliva. Imagine how the brain analyzes and gets to know all its surroundings. The brain became the object of Pavlov's studies, the psychic activity of man and animals. The second decade of the 20th century, the First World War, famine and devastation reigned in Russia. And her people struggled against conditions of barbarous poverty and lawlessness. The revolution had begun in Russia. The old scholar found in himself the strength to work in a frozen laboratory. The Soviet government, appreciating the importance of Pavlov's research, resolved to provide him and his colleagues with everything necessary for work and life. He came to the conclusion that, apart from a condition of stimulation, excitement, agitation, when conditioned reflexes are generated, a reverse process also takes place in the nervous system, an inhibition for non-reinforced stimuli, so that sounds and light would not interfere with the experiments. Special soundproof chambers were created. The facts which were amassed permitted Pavlov to begin formulating doctrines about types of nervous activities. Ivan Petrovich was now over 75, but his age only intensified his research. His time now was totally absorbed by his study of the functions of higher nervous centers in the brain. He continued to operate, observe, and correspond with scholars from all over the world. By agreement with the government, a new scientific center was built for Pavlov not far from Leningrad, in the village of Koltushin. Here he could work and rest. The scholar was over 85 years old. As before, dressed modestly, he limped, but he was extraordinarily active and energetic. He would come to the laboratory every morning. Ivan Petrovich loved, as he used to say, to think aloud. In this way, the time he would spend in the lab would elapse. On Wednesdays, the days of his consultations, he would come into contact with his colleagues or with an entire group. And he would begin to ponder over the experiments which had been set up, or over various questions of the physiology of higher nervous activity. He was accustomed to airing his ideas out loud, listening to objections, stirring up a discussion or arguments. He needed someone to talk to. And there always was someone to talk to. Someone who wouldn't always agree with everything that Ivan Petrovich said. Ivan Petrovich's need of meditating aloud, of having an audience to agree or not to agree, or to raise objections. This was typical of Ivan Petrovich Pavlov's power of creative activity. Pavlov himself said, our physiology, I mean not only my, but my numerous colleagues as well, physiology is a new and particular physiology. That of the brain, the physiology of higher nervous activity, as we call it. One must say that it is not being accepted particularly easily. It is not coming into fashion particularly easily. It is gaining for itself citizens' rights in science and in the minds of educated people with great difficulty and very gradually. However, we ourselves, the ones who have been studying it for several decades, every day are convinced that we are standing on the true path and that some important use will come out of all this. This conviction ripened, especially at the time when our studies on animals were applied to the pathology of the nervous system and to medical treatment. Thus, before us looms our ever-increasing power over phenomena of the nerves. It is understandable, of course, that we have always wanted to connect these laboratory achievements of ours with human needs. So, I'm now visiting a nerve clinic and a psychiatric clinic. Laboratory work yielded a remarkable result. In the clinic, therapeutic sleep became one of the methods of treating psychic diseases. This method was based on the theory of conditioned reflexes. The prolonged rest of the nerve centers during sleep permits the patient's brain to rest and to renew the functions which were thought to be lost. In our days, in this clinic bearing the name of Pavlov, research on the work of the brain continues. The very newest apparatus enables one to obtain even more refined data for the study of reflex activity. In the clinic, not only sick people are examined, but those who are completely healthy. New methods of treating the mentally ill on Pavlovian principles are analyzed, compared, and adopted. In this room, the great Russian physiologist academician Ivan Petrovich Pavlov held clinic conferences Wednesdays from 1931 through 1936. Pavlov credited his own good health to energy and curiosity. He was a connoisseur of painting. He collected stamps. He had an herbarium. He loved music. His library numbered in many hundreds of volumes. Despite his age, Ivan Petrovich was as indefatigable and ardent as Eve. In the summer, he would go swimming in any weather. He planted flowers, raked the paths. He still played gorodki, skittles, an ancient Russian game he had loved since childhood. He would play heatedly, sparing neither himself nor his partners. At the time, he was 84. the capital of the conditioned reflex for nothing. Foreign scholars kept coming in droves. The English writer H.G. Wells was one of Ivan Pavlov's guests. He is the one who said, "In 100 years, Pavlov's work will be appreciated even more than during his lifetime." This prediction of the writer and visionary is already coming true now. Pondering over the differences between humans and animals, Pavlov concluded that for human higher nervous activity, signals of a particular type have the major significance. Signals which are connected with man's vocal activity, with speech, with the production of the sounds of speech, as well as with the analysis and understanding of speech. Ivan Petrovich called this system of speech signals a secondary signal system, emphasizing that it constitutes a particular additional feature distinguishing human higher nervous activity from that of animals. The conditioned reflexes that Pavlov studied in animals make up a first signaling system. But because animals do not have speech, their intellectual activity is limited, as Pavlov said, by object thinking, by concrete thinking. The characteristic of human thinking is the ability not only to learn from experience, but especially to generalize concepts. The Academy of Sciences, the Pavlov Institute of Physiology today, is a huge scientific establishment with hundreds of scientific workers. Written on the statue are Pavlov's words, "Let the dog, man's helpmate and friend since prehistoric times, sacrifice itself to science, but our virtue makes it incumbent upon us for this always to take place without unnecessary torment." The world's leading physiologists came to Leningrad for their 15th International Congress. Academician Pavlov was elected president. The Congress proclaimed Pavlov elder of the world's physiologists. He spoke. Our government is now giving extraordinarily large amounts of material support to scientific work, and it is attracting masses of our youth to science. And the worldwide contribution that youth makes to science should have a huge significance. Finally, in the third place, we are so happy right now, we are delighted that we are joined by your cordial greeting in our vital universal task. We are dear comrades, in many instances joined together by our obvious friendly feelings. We are evidently working for a rational and decisive union of our common interests. At the present, what is seen is an obvious, universal desire and aspiration for avoiding wars, and very likely with stronger means than up to now. And I am pleased that the government of my motherland has for the first time joined. 6 months later, on February 27, 1936, Pavlov passed away. All of Leningrad buried him. A long human life had been lived out, a life totally devoted to science. Pavlov introduced new standards of objectivity in scientific experimentation. His study of conditioned reflexes has affected nearly every sphere of learning activity. His methods of creating experimental neuroses in animals have influenced the control of human mental illnesses. To youth dedicating themselves to science, I wish them consistency, first and foremost, wrote Pavlov. From the very start of your work, inculcate strict discipline in yourselves in the amassing of knowledge. Secondly, modesty. And thirdly, zeal. Remember that science demands of a man his entire life. And that if you had 2 lives, they wouldn't suffice. Be zealous in your quest.
Okay, you can turn the lights on. We're through, and I'll see you next Monday.